Welcome, and thank you for joining this long, wandering journey through time. A journey that follows a single thread of human curiosity, ritual, medicine, rebellion, and culture. It is the story of how people began to smoke cannabis, how its meanings evolved across civilizations, and how a simple plant became a quiet companion to the human story. Settle in, breathe slowly, and allow this tale to unfold as if it were an old documentary narrated beside a campfire under an ancient sky. Long before the modern world mapped the earth with borders, long before empires traded spice for gold and silk. For stories, the cannabis plant grew wild across Central Asia. Its leaves fluttered in winds that carried dust from migrating tribes and the early footsteps of humanity's restless search for understanding. Archaeologists believe the first human interactions with cannabis occurred not because it was extraordinary, but because it was ordinary. A fiber plant, a seed-bearing weed that could flourish in almost any soil. Early communities likely harvested it for rope and coarse fabrics, marveling at its strength. But the plant held secrets beyond its stems and fibers, secrets waiting for the right combination of curiosity and chance. The earliest evidence of people intentionally burning cannabis comes from ancient burial sites in the Xinjiang region and the Altai Mountains, where preserved wooden braziers still contain traces of psychoactive resin. These were not casual experiments, but purposeful rituals. Imagine small nomadic groups gathered around a fire at the edge of the steppe, the cold mountain wind pulling at their clothing while the shaman tended the glowing embers. Into the heat he placed cannabis flowers, releasing a fragrant, resinous smoke. The smoke curled upward in soft ribbons, blurring the boundary between earth and sky, between the visible and the invisible. For these early communities, the plant was a bridge, a medium to speak with ancestors, spirits, or whatever forces governed their fragile world. As trade routes formed, cannabis traveled with merchants and wanderers who carried not only goods, but beliefs. It reached the Indus Valley, where ancient medical texts like the Atharva Veda described it as one of the 5 sacred plants, a gift from the gods meant to relieve sorrow and bring joy. Here, cannabis was not just smoked. It was prepared as a drink, infused into rituals, woven into medicine, and shaped into the fabric of cultural identity. Yet smoking it remained a practice associated with ascetics, wandering sages, and those who sought altered perception not for pleasure but for revelation. When they inhaled the smoke from earthen chillums, they believed they were inhaling something older than themselves, a piece of the universe made tangible. To the west, Scythian tribes were developing their own relationship with the plant. They used cannabis smoke in purification rituals, sometimes within felt-covered tents that acted as ancient saunas. Herodotus, the Greek historian, wrote with astonishment about these rites, describing how the Scythians would throw cannabis seeds onto hot stones, producing thick, aromatic vapors. They shouted with joy, he said, as the smoke filled the enclosed space. Whether the shouting was a display of ecstasy, liberation, or simply the shock of a powerful sensation, no one can say for certain. But through this account, the ancient world left us a vivid snapshot of early cannabis use. Smoke as both celebration and catharsis. As centuries passed and civilizations expanded, cannabis continued to wander. In the Middle East, it became the subject of philosophy, poetry, and controversy. Across the Islamic world, its use shifted from ritual to recreational and medicinal contexts. Here the smoking of hashish, a concentrated resin of the plant, emerged. Hashish was often rolled, pressed, or crumbled into pipes. In bustling medieval cities like Cairo and Baghdad, hashish cafés appeared as social centers where musicians played soft melodies, travelers exchanged tales, and poets drank in inspiration mixed with the fragrant smoke. Authorities attempted to ban it at times, but cannabis had already found a home in culture. It was too intertwined with creativity, companionship, and quiet rebellion for any ban to completely erase. Meanwhile, in Africa, cannabis took on new lives through indigenous practices. It mingled with local traditions and healing rituals, often smoked through pipes carved from gourds or stone. Some communities used it to enhance communal bonding, while others employed it in rites of passage or divination. In each context, cannabis did not replace existing customs, it adapted to them. The plant was always flexible, always ready to become what people needed, whether comfort, insight, or relief. The arrival of cannabis in Europe came more slowly and cautiously. Medieval Europeans were familiar with hemp for rope, textiles, and sails, long before they recognized any psychoactive qualities. The great ships that traveled to the New World were held together by hemp fibers harvested from fields across the continent. But true smoking culture did not become widespread in Europe until contact with Eastern traditions and the rise of global trade. When travelers returned with tales of aromatic resins and exotic pipes, curiosity grew. Some scholars, scientists, and physicians began to experiment with cannabis extracts, fascinated by its effects on pain, mood, and imagination. By the 18th and 19th centuries, cannabis had captured the interest of European writers, explorers, and doctors. In Paris, a group of artists and intellectuals known as the Club des Hachishans gathered to explore altered consciousness. They smoked or ingested hashish in lavish settings, then recorded their experiences in vivid detail. Their writings reveal how the plant began shifting from sacred and communal use toward personal introspection. This was a turning point. Cannabis was no longer primarily a tool of ritual or medicine. It was becoming a companion to creativity and curiosity. The story continued across the Atlantic. Cannabis arrived in the Americas through multiple channels: Spanish hemp cultivation, African cultural practices brought tragically through the slave trade, and Asian labor migrations. Indigenous communities blended it into their own knowledge systems, while urban populations experimented with it socially. The early 20th century, however, brought political shifts that cast cannabis into controversy. Governments began regulating and criminalizing it, driven by fear, misinformation, and social tensions. These policies reshaped public perception for decades, creating a divide between traditional uses and modern legal frameworks. Yet cannabis proved resilient. Despite restrictions, it found footholds in subcultures that valued freedom of expression. From jazz musicians in the 1930s who used it to ease the intensity of their craft, to the counterculture movements of the 1960s who embraced it as a symbol of peace and resistance. Smoking cannabis evolved into a cultural language. Each group used it differently, but always with an undercurrent of seeking something: ease, creativity, connection, or escape. Today, as many parts of the world rethink old laws and rediscover the plant's therapeutic potential, the story of cannabis comes full circle. Scientists research its chemical complexity, patients use it to manage chronic conditions, and cultures continue to redefine its meaning. But despite these modern layers, the act of smoking it, the slow ignition of dried flowers, the rising plume of smoke, the inhalation followed by contemplative silence, remains deeply connected to ancient roots. It is, in a sense, a continuation of a human tradition thousands of years old. Imagine all these moments braided together. A shaman in the mountains placing cannabis on glowing coals, a Scythian warrior shouting with joy inside a steaming tent, a medieval poet in Cairo brushing ash from his fingers, a Parisian writer describing an otherworldly vision, a jazz musician leaning back after a long improvisation, a modern patient seeking relief, a storyteller today recounting this winding narrative. Though separated by time, geography, and belief, they share an experience shaped by the same plant and the same instinct to seek more from the world than what our eyes alone can show. And so this long tale reaches its quiet conclusion, though the story itself continues to grow with every generation. Thank you for traveling through history with me and for allowing this documentary-style narrative to unfold through your imagination. If you enjoyed this extended journey and want more stories woven with the same depth and care, don't forget to subscribe and stay connected, because history is full of paths just waiting to be explored, and every step forward is easier when we walk together. As the story of cannabis continued threading itself through human civilization, another layer began forming, one connected not to ritual nor to rebellion, but to the quiet personal relationship individuals developed with the plant. In many corners of the world, people found comfort in the act of smoking it, not as a political statement nor a ceremonial duty, but as a moment of stillness. A shepherd resting after a long day, a traveler seeking warmth on a cold desert night, a laborer unwinding after hours of toil. All discovered in the drifting smoke a sense of temporary escape, a gentle loosening of the burdens that life inevitably carried. In some regions, smoking cannabis merged with hospitality customs. In the highlands of Morocco, the kif pipe became a symbol of friendship. Visitors were greeted with tea, bread, olives, and often a small communal pipe passed between hands. After the first inhalation, conversation softened, the harshness of the day eased, and stories poured out like water. This was not a ritual in the religious sense, yet it carried a sacred feeling, the sacredness of human connection. Hospitality wrapped itself around the smoke, turning it into a gesture of welcome. Travel eastward to the Indian subcontinent and imagine the narrow alleys surrounding an ancient temple. Among them, groups of sadhus sit cross-legged around small fires, preparing chillums with practiced, reverent gestures. Their fingers, stained with ash, pack the clay pipe before raising it upward in a symbolic greeting to the divine. The first inhalation is never taken selfishly. It is dedicated to a higher presence. What matters here is not intoxication, but intention. For these ascetics, the smoke represents a temporary thinning of the veil between the physical and spiritual worlds. Their chants rise with the smoke, mingling into a single flow that drifts softly above the rooftops. Far across the oceans, indigenous cultures in the Americas developed their own ways of integrating cannabis once it arrived through complex historical channels. Some communities adapted it into existing smoking traditions, combining it with herbs already used for cleansing or guidance. Though cannabis was not native to the Americas, its arrival found fertile ground. Pipe culture had deep roots, and the plant was woven naturally into the symbolism of smoke as a tool for communication. Between humans, between clans, and between worlds seen and unseen. In these traditions, smoke was not merely substance, it was meaning. As age after age passed, the world found itself moving steadily toward the modern era. And with that transition came new forms of understanding. The plant, once approached with reverence or mystery, began attracting the attention of scholars and physicians. In the 19th century, as laboratories blossomed across Europe and scientific curiosity blossomed like a fever, cannabis became the subject of chemical experiments. Researchers extracted oils, tinctures, and resins, seeking to understand the mechanisms behind the calming, euphoric, and sometimes visionary states it induced. Medical journals recorded observations of patients who experienced relief from pain, sleeplessness, and spasms, conditions that had long tormented people across civilizations. But even as these insights emerged, the world was changing in ways that complicated the plant's place in society. Industrialization brought new social tensions, new forms of migration, and new anxieties. In the early 20th century, As political leaders sought to project control and order, cannabis found itself caught in the crossfire. Laws emerged, some rooted in genuine concern, many rooted in prejudice or misinformation. Cannabis was portrayed as a dangerous force capable of destabilizing communities. Entire campaigns were raised against it, often ignoring the thousands of years during which societies had used the plant peacefully. In the shadows of Prohibition, however, cannabis did not disappear. Instead, it adapted, just as it always had. People continued to smoke it in quiet corners, behind closed doors, in hidden fields, and in whispered gatherings where music flowed and laughter softened the harshness of secrecy. In some communities, smoking cannabis became an act of quiet resistance, a rejection of narratives that did not match lived experience. In others, it became a symbol of cultural identity, something that represented creativity, unity, and an unbroken thread to ancestral practices. As the decades rolled forward, the world watched a new cultural chapter unfold. In the 1960s and 70s, young people in many countries began questioning social norms, government authority, and the rapid changes transforming their lives. Cannabis became one of the symbols of this shift, not because it caused rebellion, but because it accompanied it. Where there was music, poetry, protest, and exploration, there was often the soft glow of a shared joint or pipe. The smoke curled into the air, not as a form of escape, but as a reminder that another way of living might be possible. But history is never simple. Alongside these cultural blossoms came struggles, legal battles, social stigma, and harsh consequences for countless individuals caught in systems seeking to control the plant's influence. Entire communities bore the weight of these disparities. Yet even then, the story of cannabis remained resilient. The plant survived not because it was powerful, but because it had become interwoven with humanity itself in all its hopes, fears, joys, and contradictions. By the time the 21st century arrived, the narrative had shifted yet again. Researchers revisited cannabis not as a threat, but as a subject deserving of unbiased study. Doctors reassessed its potential, discovering evidence that echoed what ancient healers had said for millennia. Patients found relief that modern medicine sometimes struggled to provide. Cultural fears began to soften. Countries and states rewrote laws that had once seemed immovable. In this new era, smoking cannabis straddles two worlds, one ancient, one modern. A modern user lighting a pipe or rolling a joint is unknowingly echoing a Scythian stepping into a felt dome 2,000 years ago. A mystic preparing a chillum beside a temple, a medieval poet sharing hashish in a café illuminated by lanterns. The continuity is striking. Across time, across languages, across beliefs, the simple act of inhaling cannabis smoke has connected people to each other, to their emotions, and sometimes to something beyond themselves. Today, the story continues to evolve. Some see cannabis as medicine, others as a cultural ritual, others as a personal companion. Yet the act of smoking it remains deeply human, slow, deliberate, contemplative. It invites a pause in a world that rarely stops. The smoke rises gently, carrying with it memories of mountains, deserts, tents, temples, and taverns. It is a thread linking ancient breath to modern breath, ancient stories to new ones still unfolding. And as this story stretches toward the future, it invites each generation to reinterpret its meaning. Will cannabis become primarily a medical tool, a cultural symbol, a simple pleasure, or all these at once? Only time will answer. But its past is undeniable, a long, wandering, profoundly human journey. And so the tale continues, stretching further into the intricate weave between human life and the quiet resilience of this ancient plant. As societies changed and the world became more connected, cannabis found itself moving across borders with a fluidity that few other plants ever achieved. It traveled in the pockets of migrants, seeking work in the sacks of traders crossing dusty roads, in the memories of soldiers returning from distant frontiers, and in the stories whispered by wanderers who carried bits of foreign wisdom wherever they went. With each journey, the meanings attached to the act of smoking it evolved, reflecting the hopes and fears of the people who embraced it. In the Caribbean, for instance, cannabis gained new symbolic life during the 20th century. It became intertwined with spiritual and cultural identity, especially within the Rastafarian movement. For many practitioners, smoking cannabis, referred to as ganja, was not a mere indulgence, but a sacrament, a way to invite clarity, meditation, and a deeper connection with the divine. Gatherings often involved long reasoning sessions where individuals sat together, sharing a communal chalice pipe, discussing philosophy, oppression, justice, and the nature of existence. The smoke, rising in slow spirals, carried with it both personal reflection and communal purpose. It united individuals not only through its effects, but through shared understanding. As cannabis traveled into North America, the narrative expanded again. During the early jazz era, musicians in smoky clubs found cannabis to be a companion that softened the edges of exhaustion and sharpened creativity. Some described the sensation as if time slowed down, just enough for them to explore the space between notes, to bend melodies in ways that felt impossible under ordinary conditions. It became part of the atmospheric backdrop of late-night sessions, where trumpets swayed, pianos murmured, and the music took on a shape that seemed to float. In these spaces, cannabis shaped culture not through ritual, but through rhythm. But the cultural embrace of cannabis was never uniform. At every stage, waves of acceptance were followed by waves of resistance. Governments, unable or unwilling to understand its role across societies, sought to control or eliminate it. Propaganda campaigns painted frightening images, turning public opinion with exaggerations and distortions. For many people, especially those in marginalized communities, the consequences of these policies were devastating. Yet even in these harsh circumstances, the plant survived in backyards, fields, hidden corners, and memories passed quietly between generations. It endured because it had become too deeply rooted in human culture to be erased.